Okay, I am very excited to have here on the Goldstein on Gelt show New York and Miami attorney Albert Goodwin, who's well known for his work as an estate planning attorney. And of course, I guess he helps a lot of people who live in New York and in Miami. Albert, where are we reaching you today?
Well, right now I'm in New York, but I really could be anywhere depending on the day.
And sometimes even in Israel, I understand.
Sometimes even in Israel, that's correct. I love Israel.
So let me start with this question that comes up in my office a lot. You know, my day job is I'm a financial advisor. I'm based in Jerusalem, and I work with mostly people who live in Israel, but they have U.S. accounts. And they always say, Doug, should I have one will for everything in the world, or should I have two wills, one for my stuff in Israel and one for my stuff in America? Is there a single answer for this, or is it more complicated than that?
There is a very simple single answer for this. You should definitely have an Israeli will if you live in Israel. Israeli wills are pretty easy to make, and I'm going to actually go through a few options you'll have for making an Israeli will. Now, an American will is also okay, but it will have a few issues.
But you're not saying both. I just want to clarify. You're saying only have one will, and it'll cover assets on both sides of the ocean?
It's a little complicated, but there is a simple answer. It's the best thing to do is to make an Israeli will.
Wow, okay.
In Israel, with an Israeli lawyer, if you live in Israel, you need an Israeli will. That's the best way.
Why is that better than, let's say, a U.S. will?
Because a U.S. will, it will work, but there'll be a lot of red tape. You know, Israel is known a little bit for the red tape. There'll be some red tape with the Israeli will too, but the American will have much more. You'd have to translate it, certify it, have a hearing, prove it. I don't think Israeli courts like foreign documents very much. I know that American courts don't like foreign documents, although they will accept them. So if you're asking, will an American will work in Israel? Yes, it will work. But if you're asking what is the best thing to do, the more convenient thing to do is to make an Israeli will.
So let's talk about the type of person I see, and I know there's nothing normal in your world, but a couple, let's say they lived in New York, they retire, and they make Aliyah, they move to Israel. So they keep their brokerage accounts and their IRAs and maybe even an apartment in New York, but they live in Jerusalem. Now they're going to write one document, one will. Let me clarify. Is it right for them to have one will, an Israeli will that would cover everything, or should these people think of having two wills?
The way it's going to work in the estate proceedings, if they choose to go with wills, now they can also make a trust, but if they choose to go with a will, they will have two separate probate proceedings, one in Israel and one in the United States. Now, I'm going to go into something else a little bit here, is what I recommend for people who have property in two different countries is to make a trust, not a will. What you do is you transfer the property to the trust, and then after your death, you would not have any issues going to two courts in two separate countries. The property will be taken over by the trust. I think it's best to have two separate wills, an American one and an Israeli one. They should be identical in content, but one American, one Israeli.
Doesn't a will always start with the phrase, this is my final will and testament, and all previous wills and testaments are now canceled? In which case, wouldn't that be a problem to have two documents?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think it'll be fine.
We're talking with Albert Goodwin, who is an estate attorney. He specializes in fact, estate litigation, which hopefully we'll have a chance to touch on a little bit. But Albert, you brought up a topic which I think is important, so let's get some definitions on the table. If a person wants to have a trust in order to perhaps ease the transition of assets from himself to his heirs, how does he set that up, and what does that really mean?
For a trust to work, you'd have to set it up, and it's sort of like a corporation. It has its own tax ID and it has its own documents, and you'd have to transfer all of your property into that trust. So for a lot of people, it's an inconvenience to have property owned by a trust as opposed to owned on your name. It's a little bit of a hassle filing taxes. Obviously I know more about this on the American side than on the Israeli side, but there are a lot of pluses of trusts, as well as an inconvenience. The plus side is that you would avoid this probate, at least in the United States, and the property would just pass to your heirs sort of automatically upon your death. That's with a trust, as opposed to a will where you need to go to court in America. And let's say if all of your kids are in Israel, for them to go to court in America is sort of an inconvenience. So, there is no perfect way of setting this stuff up. So you'd always have to balance sort of the inconveniences and decide which ones are the least inconvenient for you.
Some trusts are revocable and some are irrevocable. Other than the obvious definition, what's the practical difference between the two?
Well, the obvious factor is the revocable trusts are revocable and the irrevocable trusts are irrevocable. It gets sort of complicated because even the irrevocable trusts are often also revocable. So you can revoke an irrevocable trust. The problem with that is once you revoke it, you lose the benefits of the revocable trust. A lot of the trusts that I recommend are revocable because you have the flexibility of just changing them around and modifying them without tripping any of the estate planning that you do.
Mm-hmm. Would either of these two types of trusts help a person to avoid taxes, or are they going to be taxed either way?
No, it used to be many years ago that you would get some tax benefit from trusts, but I don't think that's any longer the case. There are a few factors why that's the case. Part of it is the accounting doesn't make sense anymore because of the market where the interest rates are not as high as they used to be. So any tax benefits you would get from sort of beating the interest on trusts are sort of non-existent these days. So the investment environment is partly to blame. Also, American tax laws have changed. Again, I'm not sure about how it works in Israel, but right now in America, very few people can get any tax benefits from trusts. And even the people who do get tax benefits from the trusts, those tax benefits, if you deeply look into it, are not even from the trusts, but from something else.
Mm-hmm. I also think that now that the U.S. has as far as estate tax, in other words, death tax, now a couple can have over $10 million. This really, all the planning doesn't apply so much to people. But one of the things I'll just mention for people who are listening in the United States but have children in Israel, one of the common issues that we see is it's common, like you say, a person will go to a lawyer like you in America, he'll set up a trust and he's going to name his kids as beneficiaries. And what he doesn't realize is that recent Israeli legislation has made that trust taxable in Israel simply because there is an Israeli beneficiary. So I'm no expert on this. There are people who are real experts on Israeli taxation of trusts. But if you have such a trust set up for your kids or grandchildren and they live in Israel, you absolutely need to get proper counsel to make sure you're not actually creating a worse tax situation when you thought you might have been improving it. Have you seen people make these sort of mistakes?
Well, I'm not sure if there is an estate tax in Israel.
It's not estate tax. So this tax would actually be taxed on the income that the trust earns, which could be substantial, and the tax could therefore be very substantial.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think that any country tries to tax their citizens on any kind of income. Israel is no exception. I think that most countries will say that if you live here, we will tax you on your income no matter where that income comes from. Mm-hmm. So it's no surprise that when you set up a trust, and some of the income goes to your children who are in Israel, Israel will try to tax that as an income tax.
That's right. Certainly something you have to watch out about.
I live in Florida and New York, mostly in Florida actually. But Florida does not have an income tax, right? And New York does. But any money I make in New York would still tax me for that income, even though my residence is technically in Florida.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of planning, a lot to be careful of. I think a lot of times people think, oh, it's an easy solution. I'll put my money into a trust or I'll move to Florida. And there's nothing easy. The tax authorities, I guess.
Always get you.
Yeah, and they're pretty smart. You know, Albert, you certainly shared a lot of great information with us today, but unfortunately, we are just about out of time. In the last few seconds, tell me, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Sure. I mean, I'd love to have people look at my website. It's got a lot of interesting stuff about estate planning and estate litigation, and it has funny pictures on it, so that's interesting.
Always good.
The easiest way to find me is to type in Albert Goodwin, New York attorney, on Google, and my website would come up. And the actual name of the website is nyestatesLawyer.com. I'd love to see you guys there.
Okay, we will put a link to that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Albert Goodwin, thanks so much for your time.
No problem, Doug. Always a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.